Hello everyone and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going on our second nostalgia trip ever as we talk about going to the arcades in the 80s and 90s. We're going to talk all about that nostalgia trip in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It's all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC, Lewis W., Martin Steiner, James Nunn, Yuzu Soda, Vince Gameplays, Hammond Egger, and Marek. Thanks to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start talking about what it felt like to go to arcades in the 80s and 90s, I figured it'd be a good idea to let everybody know why I chose to talk about this experience for today's episode. And the simple fact is, it's because we haven't done a nostalgia trip in a while. For anybody who may recall, we had our very first nostalgia trip episode probably around, 2 years ago, somewhere around there at that point. I think we had a nostalgia trip episode on EverQuest, and the whole concept behind the nostalgia trip format is these are experiences that we can't replicate today. Most of the games we talk about, we can replicate today in some capacity, whether that's playing on original hardware or emulating the experience, and we can kind of recreate the feeling of that experience, even if it was something that came out 30 or 40 years ago. There are other experiences, though, that we simply can't recreate. As an example, EverQuest. EverQuest is an MMORPG, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. And MMORPGs typically evolve over the course of their lifetime. When EverQuest originally released back in the late 90s, it was a certain game, and that is the game that I played. Now, it's 2026. It's over, oh my goodness. It's almost 30 years. Almost 30 years since the release of EverQuest. That is a sobering thought. But if I sat down to play EverQuest today, even if I was playing on the classic servers or whatever, I couldn't really recreate that same feeling that I had playing EverQuest back when I was younger. I also wouldn't have the same guildmates. I wouldn't have the same friends online. I wouldn't have the same overall just experience. The thing that made EverQuest so special to me was the combination of everything that surrounded that moment in time. So, rather than try to play EverQuest today and pass judgment as to whether it's Pantheon worthy, I figured we would do a nostalgia trip where rather than play the game, I would just reminisce about the game. We did that a couple years ago, and I haven't really touched the nostalgia trip format since. But then, just recently, I was thinking about the whole arcade experience, and it hit me. Well, hey, that arcade experience, going to the arcades in the 80s and 90s, that is no longer a thing. I mean, sure, there are arcades that exist today. There are mega arcades that exist today. You have places like Dave & Buster's. You have Round One Entertainment. There are others out there across the world that give you that arcade experience. And there's even arcades today that focus on retro gaming, where you can walk in and see your favorite classic titles lined up along the wall alongside pinball tables. And you just have, or pinball machines, I should say, but you have these experiences available today. But even going to the arcades, even ones that try to replicate that retro experience today, it's just not the same. It is not the same feeling, and I have such fond memories of spending countless hours in various arcades over the course of my lifetime. And as I was thinking about what episode to do for today, as I was looking at things, and this was actually, for anybody who's out on Discord, this was actually an adjustment to our original roadmap, because I originally planned to talk about a game called GOD today, which is a JRPG, but that's a lot of game. There's a lot of game included in the JRPGs, and I needed a little bit more time in order to actually finish that game and give it the justice that it deserves. So I started to pivot, and I started to think, well, what could I do as a different, an alternate episode for this week's episode? And I thought to myself, man, I've been thinking about the arcades a lot recently. Why don't we go on a nostalgia trip? So that is exactly what we're going to do today as we begin our nostalgia-fueled journey into the arcades of the 1980s and 90s. Our first stop on our nostalgia-fueled journey starts with all of you, because we did get several listener comments about arcades of the 80s and 90s. The first one is from Steve, who writes, "There is a place way up north Minnesota that we would go to, and while we waited for pizza, go to the game room area. Pool, pinball, but of course, some games. Spy Hunter, Excite Bike, Tron. So good. So many quarters. And then at the mall, there was an arcade, and I remember playing the latest 4-player game whenever we went. X-Men, Simpsons, TMNT. Those are my memories of late 80s and early 90s and playing games at the arcade. And now, when I go to the local arcade, I always throw some quarters in Tron. I love that game. Excite Bike on the NES, and our challenge we had took me back to the pizza place and playing on the cabinet there. Thank you for listening." Well, thank you, Steve, for sending in your comment. And yes, the arcades of the 80s and 90s were a magical place. And I'm glad that one of our challenges actually brought you back and gave you a little bit of your own nostalgia as we're going along the way. For anybody who may not be aware, what Steve's talking about is we routinely have various challenges that we post out on Discord. Each game that we talk about has some challenges. We also have a couple of Olympic events over a period of time. We just did our first Winter Olympics, where there was a bunch of challenges over a several-week period with everybody competing. There's a lot of fun out there in Discord, but I am glad that that challenge brought you back to your youth and the 80s and 90s arcade experience. We also received a note from ISO, who writes, "My earliest memories of arcade machines are point-blank light gun machine out in front of a supermarket in Palmerston, Darwin. It was a fun collection of minigames I loved to try out. Metal Slug 3 in our bowling alley, where me and my brother were in a competition league. Our team was the Lightning Strikers, and a lasting memory was seeing Street Fighter 2 show up in our local city markets. I was captivated without even playing it, jumping around the backyard, yelling, 'Hadouken!' And sorry, I added the sound effect myself. Thank you, ISO, for writing in. We're going to talk all about bowling alleys, because bowling alleys, even though they weren't arcade-centric, are definitely where I experienced some of my fondest arcade memories. So we were definitely going to talk about bowling alleys. I actually was in a league myself a couple times over the course of my life when I was younger. So thank you, ISO, for writing in. And then we also got a message from Sneaky Pete, who writes, "Random arcade story. When I was in middle school and lived in Texas, there was a restaurant chain called Fuddruckers. Even as a not quite teenager, the name of this place always stuck out as a Freudian slip just waiting to happen." Yeah, I get that. Anyways, they had a modest arcade section, and you could buy a fountain soda with free refills. The one that was walking distance from my house had a 4-player game that was very similar to Sunset Riders. So good, except that you played as literal cowboys, like you were all cows with guns, hats, and spurs. The game itself was decent, but the real draw was when we figured out that whenever you hit the game over screen, if you pounded the buttons as fast as you could, it would let you play again without putting in a quarter. So my friends and I would walk over with 1 or 2 quarters and enough money for a soda, and our entire afternoon was good to go. Thank you, Sneaky Pete, for that comment. Yeah, that's, I haven't thought about Fuddruckers in the longest time. And apparently it was fairly popular with most of our Discord community, because that one mention of Fuddruckers was enough to start a chain of people reminiscing about Fuddruckers. It was, and that's kind of the way our Discord goes. Sometimes there's a random comment that gets made, and then we start talking about something that is totally non-game related anyway. I mean, I'm looking, just scanning through. There was the cheese sauce, the jalapeno cheese sauce from Fuddruckers. Everybody remembers that one. It's a good place. I remember going to Fuddruckers. There was one that was actually not far from where I lived back when I was younger, and we would go there fairly frequently. I would say maybe, I don't know, once every 2 to 3 weeks. I mean, we were kids. It was easy. You walk up to the counter, you order, and then just mess around. And yeah, there was an arcade there. I don't remember which games I played at the Fuddruckers arcade, but I definitely remember Fuddruckers. And oh, by the way, if anybody is wondering what that game was that Sneaky Pete was talking about, Samwise Gamergy, another member of our Discord, did find the game. It was called Wild West COW, so that's cow, Boys of Moo Mesa, which I've got to say looks really interesting. I'm so glad that was found. I have never heard of that game before in my life, but I think it is awesome when we can all help each other out and find games from our youth. So thank you, Sneaky Pete, for your comment. Thank you, Samwise, for finding the game. Thank you all who participated out there on Discord, providing various pieces of feedback about arcades and what it felt like to go to arcades in the 80s and 90s. With that, we're going to begin my own nostalgia trip through gaming in the 80s and 90s, specifically in arcades. As you might expect, given the fact this is a different format than we traditionally do, this episode is going to feel just a little bit different than our traditional episodes. We are going to talk a little bit about the history of arcades, but nothing too deep, because my focus here is really the act of re-experiencing what it felt like to go to the arcades in the 80s and 90s, and I'll explain exactly how we're going to tackle that in just a couple minutes. But first, just a little bit about the history of arcades, because arcades have existed and had existed for a very long time. Even before digital arcade machines came into existence in the 70s, there were plenty of arcades around that featured pinball machines. You also had electromechanical devices. We've talked in the past about early electromechanical arcade machines like Periscope. Sega had made Periscope back even before digital arcade machines were a thing. It was built entirely from electromechanical devices, actual lights, actual machinery that would work in tandem to give you that arcade kind of experience. As the 1970s rolled around, there was a shift from pure electromechanical arcade machines to more of the digital frontier. That's where you started to see arcade classics like Pong and Space Invaders and Asteroids and countless other titles start to be developed and released. And with those releases, the arcade became a destination for gamers around the world. Now, I was born in 1981, so admittedly, I missed the earliest digital arcade expansions that happened in the 70s. That said, going to the arcades and sometimes just playing arcade games in different venues had a truly formative impact on my lifelong love of video games. We're going to go through a mostly chronological journey through a bunch of my arcade memories. I have tried wherever possible to literally list out the specific arcades and scenarios that I experienced as I explored different arcade games throughout the course of my earlier years. In almost all cases, I remember these experiences vividly, even though some of them occurred well over 40 years ago, which is crazy to think about. Anyway, with that, let's start our discussion, and we're going to start with my earliest arcade memories, which is visiting an arcade that was called The Galaxy back in 1984. Now, in 1984, I was 3 years old, so I did not have fully developed anything at that point. But my aunt, who basically raised me from when I was a baby, she would oftentimes take me out and go different places because that's what you do with kids. You take them out and have them experience different things. And one of the things that we used to love to do was to go to this place in Philadelphia. We used to live in the Albany section of Philadelphia. We would go to this place called The Galaxy, and this was the coolest arcade ever. Now, granted, this is a nostalgia trip episode, which means I am looking through everything with rose-tinted nostalgia goggles. So I have no idea what it looked like in reality. I only remember what my memory of it was. And I remember walking into this location that had all of these blaring lights and sounds, arcade machines stretched across every single wall, pinball tables, skee-ball, everything was there. I knew the very first moment I stepped into that arcade, it felt like I had entered Nirvana. I was so happy. I wasn't really that good at playing games back when I was 3 years old, but it didn't matter because I still wanted to play nearly everything. So when I was when I first started visiting the arcade, the game that I mostly played was skee-ball because it was relatively easy. It was something where you put your quarter in the machine, a bunch of these hard balls rolls down, and then all you have to do is roll the ball up the ramp and get it into one of several scoring zones. You get some points. You may even get tickets, depending on if the arcade that you're playing at has some sort of prize redemption kind of feature, and then maybe you get a prize for all that work. When I was 3, I couldn't really roll the ball all that well either. So I remember vaguely, this one is a little bit less vivid than some of my later memories because, like I said, I was 3. But I remember being stood up on the skee-ball machine itself because I didn't have the strength to be able to roll the skee-ball all the way up the ramp. So I remember being stood up on the machine and I kind of tossed it up there and got some points. But even though I was probably really bad at the game, and even though I really couldn't play the game all that well, this was my very earliest memory of going to an arcade, and because of that, I will always cherish that memory. Now, the Galaxy, we would go to over many years, because we lived in Philadelphia until maybe, I guess it was 1989-ish, where we moved to New Jersey from Philly. So we would go to the Galaxy pretty much the entire time we lived in Philadelphia, from the point that I was 3 all the way to the point where we left and went, or when we moved over to New Jersey. And over a period of time, I would get older and I would develop additional skills that I was able to use on these various arcade games. And as we talk through my various arcade experiences, I'm going to shout out certain arcade titles that left a lasting impression on me. One of those games that I used to love playing at the Galaxy was Karate Champ. If anybody has been hanging out on Discord, you will recognize that Karate Champ, for some reason, and I honestly don't know why, has gotten a little bit of a bad rap. There are people out on Discord that do not like Karate Champ. They think that the controls are too, finicky or simple, that the gameplay is kind of too random as far as whether you score a hit or not. There's kind of a negative perception around Karate Champ. I'm going to tell you right now, I do not understand that negative perception, because for me, Karate Champ is one of the greatest games from around this era of gaming that I remember playing. I used to play Karate Champ. I don't even know how long I would play it, but I would just keep pumping quarters into the machine. I would even have a chance to play against much older kids when I was going to the arcade, because the arcade was a very social experience. This is something that even if you didn't go to the arcade with friends, just because there were other like-minded kids around you, you would strike up impromptu friendships just being at the arcade. And I would be playing Karate Champ, and then this other kid would come over and be like, hey, you want to play a round or a match? And I'd say, well, yeah, of course. Why not? So he'd put his quarter in the machine. We'd have a match of Karate Champ. From what I understand, I would most of the time win. Now, I don't know if that was a story told to me to bolster my own confidence or not, but apparently I was pretty good at Karate Champ back when I was younger. But regardless of whether that's true or not, Karate Champ was such a fun game. And I remember thinking to myself, man, I am a true karate master because I was able to use the joysticks and use the different controls in just the right way. And over time, I really did become pretty proficient with the game. I actually went back to play Karate Champ, not the arcade version, but the NES version, not all that long ago. And I've got to say, I still like the game. I don't know if that's a nostalgia thing because it just brought me back to standing on a step stool at the Galaxy Arcade playing against other kids. But for whatever reason, I just really like Karate Champ. I just think it's a great game. Anyway, another game that I used to play back when we'd go to the Galaxy, and this is probably the one that I played even more than Karate Champ, was a game called Gladiator. And I actually mentioned Gladiator not all that long ago on the show. The concept behind this game is that you controlled a gladiator, a warrior with armor and weaponry. And as you would move through the different stages in the game, the cool thing was that your armor pieces could be knocked off of you, and you could knock armor pieces off of your opponents, which basically meant in order to create weaknesses for your opponent or for the opponent to create weaknesses for you, you would have to lose different armor pieces by hitting that armor off of that opponent. It was a really cool concept. You had the ability to, I believe there were 3 levels of attack and defense where you could raise your shield either up towards your head, against your body, or more towards your legs. And similarly, from an attack perspective, you could attack either at the head level, or the chest level, or the leg level. So there was some strategy here, and you had to figure out when it made sense to make the right attacks in order to deplete your opponent's armor and avoid having your own armor depleted. It was such an amazing game, and I remember thinking to myself, how could things get any better than this? Because this was so unlike other arcade games that were there. I mean, I played a bunch of the classics back when I was younger. I played Space Invaders and Asteroids and Defender and all of those kind of games. But Gladiator was the first game that felt like it had something extra, at least for me. It felt like it had something extra included with the whole experience because it wasn't just hitting another opponent. It wasn't just trying to attack unending waves of bad guys. You had this strategy element baked into it because you had the ability. You had the ability to knock armor off of your opponent, and they had the ability to knock armor off of you. I just remember thinking, this is awesome. And I had never experienced before a game where the actual visual associated with your character could change over time. Because you start the level and you might have a full suit of armor. By the time you get to the end of the level, maybe your whole chest armor is gone and all that's there is your big, bad, muscular body just trying to fight through all the bad guys. It was a cool thing. And I just really, that was one of those games that now that I'm thinking about it, probably formed a core memory of what a video game should be. Not to say that video games without that kind of structure or that kind of additional focus on visual fidelity or making things feel just a little bit different. Not to say that games that are a little bit more simple in terms of gameplay were bad, because I love plenty of games that had relatively simple gameplay loops. But playing Gladiator, that's a memory that's stuck with me, and I believe that has shaped the way I look at different video games. That's probably why one of the reasons that I look at games today and I like some additional complexity is because I really enjoyed that back when I was younger playing Gladiator. Of course, Gladiator is not a complex game in comparison to anything today, but back then, there was something extra to it, and I really enjoyed that extra kind of experience. Now, around the same time that I was visiting the Galaxy, and we went to the Galaxy, which would eventually be renamed Champions Arcade, from around 1984 to 1989. 1989 is when we moved to New Jersey. But during that time, we would also go to different locations that might have had arcades as well. And one of the destinations that I absolutely loved going to as a kid was the Boardwalk. Being so close to New Jersey and the Jersey Shore, and by Jersey Shore, I'm not talking about the North Jersey Shore that has been popularized by the show called the Jersey Shore. I'm talking about more the southern New Jersey kind of experience. Places like Ocean City, Wildwood, Atlantic City, although that to a bit of a lesser degree because Atlantic City wasn't really focused on kids entertainment. It was more of an adult entertainment spot. Cape May, those kind of locations in South Jersey. We would go to the boardwalk a lot when I was younger, both when we lived in Philadelphia as well as after we moved to New Jersey. And I remember walking the boardwalks, and the boardwalk was a magical place just by itself because you had all of these games of chance. You had these wheels that you could kind of put money on and potentially win a prize. And now I understand that most of those games of chance were absolutely heavily in the operator's favor. There were so many different things there, and I know that spending a ton of money on trying to win a prize that I probably could have bought for less money than I actually spent trying to win the prize. I know that logically that doesn't make any sense, but it still felt awesome to experience. And it was just cool walking around the boardwalk, playing these different games of chance. I used to love trying to shoot the basketball in the oversized, I guess, the higher than normal and rim probably smaller than normal hoops, where if you made it in, you'd be able to win like a mini basketball for the college team of your choice. There were all sorts of cool things around there. But getting back to more of the arcade kind of experience, the boardwalk had some of the most awesome arcades that I had ever experienced up to this point in my life. And I'm talking about probably from the mid 80s all the way through the mid 90s. The boardwalk had amazing arcades. This was actually my first exposure to the concept of a slot machine. Now, not for real money, of course, because as a kid, you're not going to be gambling, but they had slot machines in these arcades that mimicked the slot machines that you would see in an actual casino. The way it would work is you would put your money into the machine, whether that's tokens or literal dollars, depending on what the situation was. And you would play these slot machines, and if you won, you might win a bunch of tokens or tickets or something else that you'd be able to trade in for various prizes. One of the earliest prizes, and this is so random, but one of the earliest prizes that I thought was the coolest thing ever. I remember sitting down at a slot machine at one of the boardwalk arcades, and I won enough tokens to be able to get a prize. So I went up to the prize counter and I'm scanning the counter, and they had all sorts of cool stuff. Like they had video game systems like the NES and stuff that was ridiculously overpriced from a token perspective. Unless you won a jackpot, you're not going to be getting an NES from a boardwalk arcade. But I was scanning through the little glass display, and I noticed something that was, I thought, the coolest thing ever. They still exist today, but I don't know that they exist anywhere other than Temu and Wish.com and those kind of places, but it was a switchblade comb. So it was kind of like if you ever watched a movie where they had switchblade knives, but it wasn't a knife. It looked like a knife handle, but you press the button and instead a comb flips out. So it was a switchblade comb, and I thought, I don't know why, but I thought this is the best thing ever. It wasn't even like I brushed my hair all that much, but just having this kind of device where I could press the button, it's like, and it flips up and it's a comb. And I'm like, I am so cool right now. Oh, I was so not cool, but I thought it was the greatest thing ever. I remember trading in my tokens to get that switchblade comb, and I thought to myself, man, it doesn't get any better than this. The fact is that over the years, some of my fondest arcade memories came from the boardwalk at various southern Jersey Shore spots. Like I said, we'd go to Wildwood, Ocean City, Atlantic City, Cape May. If there was an arcade nearby and we were down the shore, because we're down the shore quite a bit, but if there was an arcade nearby, you better believe that I was going to visit it. And actually, I need to go on a little bit of a tangent right now because I was just thinking about this. I believe it was Atlantic City. They used to have a kind of mall in the center of the boardwalk. And in that mall was a KB toy store. Does anybody remember KB toy stores? It was kind of like a smaller version of Toys R Us, but it had its very own unique style and flair. Well, the KB toy store down in Atlantic City was cool because it had 2 levels to the store. I think it was 2, maybe 3 levels to the store. I think there was a main floor, and then as you went in, you could walk down a couple steps and you get to the main section of the store, but I guess that's technically the lower level. And then there were stairs that actually went up to an upper level. Now, the store wasn't all that big at the end of the day, but it didn't matter. This was a multi-level toy store. And my mind was blown. I loved going there, and we would pick up all sorts of stuff there. Nothing crazy, but it was just cool. It was just cool to visit a toy store down the shore, because when you're going down the shore, you're going on vacation, or you're going for the beach or swimming in the ocean or whatever. But to be able to go to a toy store down the shore, even though I would go to toy stores back home regularly, it didn't matter. It was like, oh, this is interesting. This is different because it's a toy store down the shore. That shouldn't be. The shore is for swimming and sandcastle building and I guess arcade going. It's not for toy stores, but it existed and it was awesome. I used to love KB toy stores. They used to have a KB toy store actually in my local mall as well, until I guess KB probably went out of business at some point. I'm guessing probably in the 90s, maybe early 2000s. I'm not entirely sure when it went out of business, but I do know that I used to love going to that place, and it doesn't exist anymore, at least to the best of my knowledge. Anyway, when we would visit the arcades down the boardwalk, there were a few different experiences that I really focused on. I played skee-ball just like I did back when I was younger, but I got a little bit better as I got older. But skee-ball has always remained one of those things that I just have always enjoyed. Also played a lot of the slot machines and the video poker machines to try to earn those tickets and tokens to let me buy even more switchblade combs and other stuff, of course. But then in later years, I would also expand to other arcade games that they would include at the boardwalk, with a couple being personal favorites. I think I've mentioned before, and it might have been on a Patreon episode now that I'm thinking about it, but I have always enjoyed any sort of arcade machine that allows me to do a test of strength, so to speak. So when arcade machines started showing up that were effectively arm wrestling machines, where you would be facing off against different opponents with different overall strength, and they actually had this mechanical arm that you would actually be able to arm wrestle and try to beat your opponents, you better believe I was all over that. I believe the first time I encountered one of the arm wrestling arcade games was down the shore at a boardwalk arcade, and I spent a good amount of time playing that. And something that you may not recognize about me is that when I like something, I really like it. So much so to the point that I might play that thing pretty darn incessantly until I decide I'm done. So the arm wrestling machine, just as an example, I remember one time where I played that thing so much that when I started to walk away, I grabbed my shoulder. I'm like, oh, what the heck happened to my shoulder? Did I injure myself somehow? No, you doofus. You just spent an hour playing the arm wrestling machine. Of course your shoulder's going to hurt. I don't know what the heck was wrong with me sometimes, but the arm wrestling arcade machine I used to really love. But the machine that I would say is probably, I've got to say it's probably one of my just complete favorites ever, was Supersonic Blastman. Let me explain the way this machine worked. Supersonic Blastman was effectively a punch meter kind of machine, but rather than just have a punching bag that drops down that you have to punch as hard as you can and then it gives you some sort of numerical readout that says how powerful your punch was, in Supersonic Blastman, you actually had a video arcade. So you had a digital representation of some scenario that was playing out. Maybe, and you were Supersonic Blastman. So maybe the situation was there is a big rig coming down the street and a baby stroller rolls out in front of the truck. And you, as Supersonic Blastman, have to stop the truck from hitting the baby stroller. So the way you do that is you have this punching bag kind of device. And I use the term punching bag loosely because this was effectively a metal arm that had a very thin pad attached to it. And the machine would have a very thin boxing-like glove attached to it. I use the phrase very thin intentionally because this is probably the arcade machine that I had the most injuries playing. And I know that must sound weird. It's like, why would you play a game that would give you a potential injury? Well, that's because it was fun. And because I'm silly. But it was so the way it worked is this metal arm popped up and it had this kind of pseudo punching bag on it. You put the boxing glove on, and then you'd have to punch that pad as hard as you could, which would knock the metal arm down, and then the machine would calculate the overall power of your punch. But rather than just showing you the number, it would show you how well you're performing in that particular scenario. So in the example that we were just talking about with the truck that's moving towards the baby stroller, you would punch as hard as you could and you would see actual damage represented on that truck. It was very, very cool. And you had a few different, I think there were 2 or 3 tries, probably like 3 tries, maybe, in order to destroy whatever object that you were trying to destroy. There was another scenario where, and I think this might have been the hardest scenario in the game, where there was an asteroid that was coming towards Earth, and you had to punch as hard as possible to destroy the asteroid before it crashed into the Earth. I played this game so much. I also was injured by this game so much. One time I had an injury to my shoulder. Another time I injured my wrist because I guess one time when I punched, I didn't have my fist squared the right way. So I kind of hit the top of my hand, which really compacted my wrist and made it sore for probably a good couple weeks. I can't condone playing games that can literally injure you, but I've got to say, it was such a good game. It was so fun. It was so fun to play. This is the kind of game that if I could ever find it out in the wild somewhere, I would absolutely play it again. And actually, for anybody who's a patron, you've heard this story. When I recently visited an arcade back in 2025, there wasn't Supersonic Blast Man, but there was another punching power machine. And at the time, I thought to myself, well, wait. Now, remember, this is 2025, so I'm 43 years old around when this is happening. I turned 44 back in 2025, but I was 43 at the time that this was happening. And I'm standing there and I'm thinking to myself, should I do it? Should I do the punching machine? And the fact is that it really wasn't a question to begin with. Of course, I'm going to do the punching machine. It's there. And I am a sucker for this kind of thing. So I go over to the punching machine and there were 2 right next to each other. And I went to this one machine and there were a couple of probably like 20, 21-year-old college guys standing next to it. They were doing their own little contest with the punching machine. And I'm this 43-year-old guy walking over by himself. I'm like, I'm going to do this too. So I hit the button. It comes down for the first punch and I get an okay punch, but nothing crazy. And I look at my number and I'm like, that's not good. I don't like that. And I looked at the guys next to me and they were doing better than me. And I'm like, no, I don't like this at all. So hit the button again. I'm like, okay, I got to get in the moment. I got to get in the eye of the tiger, like Rocky. So I'm standing there and I'm kind of bouncing back and forth and trying to look cool, even though I probably did not look cool, but I'm trying. And then I unleash the punch and go, pow! And I knocked the thing and I got better over time. And then finally, right before I was about to leave, because I didn't want to have another injury. It's one thing having an injury when you're a teenager where you can kind of walk it off and it's like, yeah, it bothers me for a couple of days and now it's good. It's another thing being a 43-year-old guy punching something repeatedly and then realizing that you can't use your hand for 2 weeks. That's not good either. So right before I was at the point of injury, I finally unleashed my greatest punch and it was better than the 2 college guys next to me. And at that point I was kind of like, I did it. And then I walked away. Now, you could say what you will about my own personal personality that makes me have to do those kind of things. But anyway, I've always been a sucker for those kind of strength games. And Supersonic Blast Man was one of those games from back when I was young that I played so much. The boardwalk just in general and the arcades there, very fond memories I have of those experiences. I also have fond memories of going to Chuck E. Cheese, which was kind of like a kid's arcade. And did anybody remember the jingle? It was like, Chuck E. Cheese is where a kid can be a kid, or something like that. I went to Chuck E. Cheese when I was younger, and I don't remember all of the specific arcade games that I would play there. I just remember the environment. I remember earning tickets to get different prizes. I remember some ride-on vehicles that you could pay for and just kind of sit in, and it just kind of bumps you around a little bit. And as a kid, that's a cool thing. As an adult, it's like you're not going anywhere. It's just kind of bouncing you up and down. Like it's not that great. But as a kid, it's like, oh, I'm driving now. And I remember my brother liked ride-on vehicles a lot as well. I also remember the Chuck E. Cheese pizza, which probably as an adult would not be all that great. But as a kid, especially combined with the rest of the environment, I loved that pizza. As a young kid, Chuck E. Cheese was an awesome place. I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I did not look up the history of Chuck E. Cheese prior to this recording, so I might get something wrong, but I thought Chuck E. Cheese went through some sort of bankruptcy or some sort of financial issue and they had to close a bunch of stores, but I also thought that I read that they were still around in some capacity. Is that true? Am I making that up? I might be making that up. But I remember Chuck E. Cheese. Chuck E. Cheese when I was younger was everywhere. There was a Chuck E. Cheese near where I lived. There was a Chuck E. Cheese at the local mall. There was a Chuck E. Cheese over somewhere else just randomly in the middle of some other strip mall. It was just a thing, and they were all over the place, and I really enjoyed going to there when I was a kid. Now, another place I liked going that I didn't go to for the arcade experience, but certainly the arcade experience was something I enjoyed about it, was going bowling. I used to love going bowling, especially in the early to mid 90s. And the whole experience of bowling was kind of a multifaceted kind of thing, because you'd go to the bowling alley because you wanted to bowl. And I really enjoyed bowling, where I just roll the ball down the lane. I try to get as many strikes as possible. I think my high score, I never really got a great high score. I want to say my high score, like all time, was maybe 235, somewhere around there. I'm not a great bowler by any stretch of the imagination, but there was a period of time where we would go to the bowling alley quite frequently, and we would bowl a lot. Oh, does anybody remember Cosmic Bowling? Has anybody done that? Is that still a thing? I hope it's still a thing. Cosmic Bowling was so cool, where you would go to the bowling alley at like midnight, and they would turn all the lights off, and they'd put a bunch of black lights on, and they would have different colored pins sometimes. And if that red pin was in the center and you got a strike with the red pin, you could earn like a free game or something like that. Oh, so much fun. I loved Cosmic Bowling. But even beyond the bowling, because we're not here talking about bowling alleys, beyond the bowling experience, every bowling alley, or at least most bowling alleys that I've been to, had some sort of arcade built into the overall location. And those arcades were typically really small, but it had some great hits, and the arcades at bowling alleys were kind of this microcosm of the broader arcade industry. There would a lot of times be these, maybe like a handful of games, maybe like 6, 7, 8 games there, but they were really cool, and it was great being able to visit an arcade after you were done bowling, or maybe in the middle of bowling. Maybe you'd bowl a game, you take a little break, you go to the arcade, you play a little bit, you come back, you bowl some more. Arcades and bowling alleys were really, really fun. And the fact is, just the whole bowling alley experience, where you would go there, you would start bowling, you might order a pizza, or maybe you get like a 2-hour for a lane deal, where you bowl for 2 hours, you get a pizza, you get your shoe rentals, and then afterwards you go and play in the arcade. There was nothing better. Back when I was a younger guy, back when I was a younger kid, there was nothing better than going to the bowling alley, eating some pizza, bowling some games, and playing in the arcade that was part of the bowling alley. It was just such an awesome experience. And there were a bunch of great games that I remember playing at my local Playdrome bowling alley. That was the name of the company. I don't know if Playdrome still exists, but it was Playdrome Bowling Alley. And I believe I went to the one that was in Glassboro, New Jersey, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think that's the location that we went to. Actually, at one point, we even joined a bowling league for a couple of, I guess, seasons. Is that what it's called with bowling leagues? Anyway, I used to love going to the bowling alley. There were a couple of arcade games that I used to play a lot when I would go to the bowling alley. One of those was Supersonic Blast Man. And let me tell you, if you think that you can get injured by Supersonic Blast Man just playing that game by itself, think about what it feels like to punch that metal arm with the very thin pad attached to it after you've just bowled for 2 hours. Let me ask you a question. How do you think that does for your wrist? What do you think that does for the wrist? If the answer is probably nothing good, you'd be right. But I still loved playing Supersonic Blast Man in the arcade at the bowling alley after I was done bowling a bunch of games. There was also Mad Dog McCree was at, and that wasn't there the whole time, but it was there. I remember playing Mad Dog McCree at the bowling alley arcade. Mad Dog McCree, we've talked about before. We had an entire episode focused on American laser games previously, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about Mad Dog McCree other than to say I love full motion video in gaming. I probably sound like a broken record at this point because I say that every chance I get, but I do love FMV in gaming. Mad Dog McCree was one of the earliest FMV experiences that I had, where you'd go in there and you'd have this gigantic monitor and the full motion video scene would be playing, and you'd have this holster, this light gun that was in a holster, and you had to actually use that light gun to shoot the bad guys on the screen, and everything on the screen would react accordingly based on that shot that you just made. I legitimately thought this was the future. This was going to be the future of gaming. Mad Dog McCree was one of the first games that introduced me to that future. Now, of course, full motion video and gaming got a little bit of a bad rap because of some of the, what I'll say, questionable quality releases that came about in the 90s. But regardless, I still love it. And Mad Dog McCree, beyond everything, especially in an arcade setting, I mean, I can't complain. There's nothing to complain about there. Mad Dog McCree was simply awesome. But even beyond the more traditional kinds of arcade games where you have these interactive experiences and you'd be able to play out either using joysticks or your fists or light guns or whatever, beyond those, one of the coolest things about bowling alley arcades were the random carnival-styled kiosks that you'd sometimes have either in the arcade itself or literally sitting right next to the reception area when you'd be trying to rent your shoes and rent a lane to bowl for a couple hours. There were a few different ones that I remember off the top of my head. One of those was kind of a fortune-telling machine where there'd be this plastic pseudo-crystal ball with a couple of metal, I guess they're diodes maybe, but a couple of metal receptors where you would kind of lean your hand on the crystal ball and you'd put a quarter in the machine and the ball would pulsate a little bit and then it would spit out some sort of printed fortune for you. Ostensibly, they read your palm and they were giving you your fortune based on that reading. In reality, I'm sure that it was just literally a random fortune that was written in such a way that it could apply to pretty much anyone. But regardless, I still did it. Every time I was at the bowling alley, I was like, hey, Dad, I got to do the fortune machine. And he'd be like, okay, Tony, sure. Here's a quarter. Okay. So I went off and I did that. There was also one machine that was, I think it was literally something like, how good of a lover are you? And you'd put your index finger and your middle finger in the machine, or kind of, there was like these similar kind of things on the crystal ball. There were like these metal receptors. You'd put your index finger and middle finger onto those receptors in the machine, and then it would spit out how good of a lover you are. And there were a few different categories, like Casanova might have been the top and like Wet Noodle might have been the bottom or something like that. Now, I don't know how appropriate it was for that machine to be there. I mean, there was nothing really offensive there, but I was like 12. I'm like, I don't even know what being a good lover is, but I wanted to be Casanova. I knew that because I was at the top, but regardless. And then there was another machine, which is another kind of test of strength machine. It was a squeeze grip kind of machine where it was like a handle and you'd have to squeeze that handle as hard as you could and try to get the most, I'm assuming it just measured your overall force or pound pressure of your squeeze, of your, how you grip kind of thing. I am a sucker for tests of strength, so you better believe I played that thing every single chance I got. I had so much fun at bowling alley arcades, and I know that it's different. Bowling alley arcades were just, like I said, a microcosm of the bigger arcades that were around back around that time, but I just loved them. I just loved the overall experience and what it felt like to go in there. And I mean, all of them always smelled. They had like a smoky smell because people most likely were smoking. They had the smell of stale pizza because, like I said, you go to a bowling alley, you got to get pizza. Sometimes they smelled like stale beer because adults were drinking beers and all that kind of stuff, but it didn't matter. That was part of the environment. And I know it must sound strange to reminisce about the sense of sweat and stale beer and microwave pizza, but I got to tell you, if they would bottle that into a cologne kind of fragrance, first of all, I would never put it on because that is disgusting sounding. But I might just spray it once and kind of sniff and be like, huh, that's an arcade. That's exactly what an arcade smelled like. Oh, man. Anyway, moving on beyond that, another unlikely spot for arcade gaming that we used to go to was our local Chi-Chi's restaurant. Chi-Chi's is a restaurant chain that unfortunately mostly closed down. I don't even remember how long ago it was at this point, but they are trying to revive the brand now. If I remember correctly, there was some sort of major food issue or recall that happened and a bunch of people got sick at a Chi-Chi's and that effectively tanked the company. There's probably more to it than that, but those were the headlines that I remembered from back when I heard Chi-Chi's was closing. But Chi-Chi's as a restaurant, putting aside the health potential issues, I used to love going to Chi-Chi's. What was the slogan? It was like Chi-Chi's a celebration of food, or something like that, if I remember correctly. Chi-Chi's was awesome. Number one, because I really enjoyed their food. They had fried ice cream. I loved their fried ice cream. Ooh. But even beyond that, even beyond the food experience, every time we would go to Chi-Chi's, they would have this rotating set of arcade games that they would have out in their main reception area, like the lobby area kind of thing. And I experienced so many arcade games that were true classics just standing in the entryway to our Chi-Chi's restaurant as we were either waiting for a table, because Chi-Chi's was fairly popular. And when we would go to Chi-Chi's, we might have to wait for 20 minutes, 30 minutes for a table. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to just sit around and talk with your family? No, you're going to play arcade games, especially if the arcade games are there. That's exactly what my brother and I did. We would play arcade games while we waited for a table. There were so many arcade games that we played over the years going to Chi-Chi's. I remember Mortal Kombat 3, which was awesome. I actually remember the original Mortal Kombat being there too, but that was so the way that Chi-Chi's worked is, like I said, they had this revolving set of arcade machines. I don't know what their overall structure was as far as when they would put certain machines out when, but I remember one time we went and they had Mortal Kombat sitting there right in the entryway. And of course, we're going to play some Mortal Kombat. But that was after Mortal Kombat had been out for a while. And then I want to say a couple months later, we went there and Mortal Kombat 3 was there. And we thought, well, of course we got to play Mortal Kombat 3. And it was such a dramatic improvement from a graphics perspective, controls, the number of characters in comparison to the original Mortal Kombat. And because it was such close proximity to when Chi-Chi's had swapped the arcade cabinets, we did a kind of a direct comparison kind of thing. And it just felt like, wow, we leapt multiple generations over the course of the last month, because from the last time we went to Chi-Chi's to today, Mortal Kombat evolved dramatically. So we played that. NBA Jam was another favorite. They had NBA Jam there for a while because NBA Jam is just awesome in general. I remember my brother and I would play that one. We would just, NBA Jam is endlessly replayable. And I know that the way it's designed and the way it's programmed is meant to facilitate the fact that games are going to generally be close. The computer is going to perform better when you're performing better and vice versa. The computer will give you a little bit of a break if you're not performing quite as well. So I know that was designed that way to keep the games exciting, but I didn't care. NBA Jam was just freaking awesome. And we would play it any chance that we got. We'd also play the Simpsons arcade game, the beat 'em up. So all of these games, a bunch of the games were the four-person varieties, the four-person variants of the game. And a lot of times would be my brother and I just playing on a team versus the computer. Occasionally there'd be other kids there that wanted to join in, and we were like, whatever, fine. We were friendly, but when you got a brother, a lot of times it's like you two are doing stuff. And if others want to tag along, that's fine, but you kind of had your own thing going. When you have a brother, it's like you have your own special language, so to speak, that you guys are on the same wavelength and everybody else kind of not. So we would play with other kids sometimes when they would come up and be like, hey, can I have a turn too? I'm like, yeah, sure. Put your quarter in. But we liked playing more so just by ourselves versus with others, at least around this time, and especially at Chi-Chi's. Anyway, we'd play the Simpsons arcade game. I remember X-Men, the arcade game, was there. That's another beat 'em up kind of title. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. Oh, that game. Who doesn't remember Big Apple, 3 a.m.? That was probably, if I'm thinking about it, my favorite games to play at Chi-Chi's back then, probably NBA Jam, definitely. NBA Jam was just great, and especially when they started to come out with other editions like the tournament edition and all that kind of stuff where they'd add additional characters and additional secrets. Oh, the secrets for NBA Jam, the schoolyard secrets where you'd have different people saying, hey, if you put in this set of initials and this birthday, you're able to unlock Michael Jordan was the big one. And it's like, you could try it out and it's like, no, nothing happened. Those secrets, the schoolyard secrets for all of these arcade games were legendary. They were also completely false. And everybody I went to school with were filthy liars. I hate them all. I'm just kidding. Mostly. Anyway, so Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time was another one of our favorites. So between everything we played at Chi-Chi's, probably NBA Jam and TMNT Turtles in Time, those were probably my two favorite games to experience at Chi-Chi's. But man, I miss Chi-Chi's. If they could ever really come back and not have the food safety issues that they once had, I would definitely go back there again. Maybe. Pending a health inspection kind of thing. I would do it. I enjoyed Chi-Chi's a lot. Now, moving beyond some of the less, I'll say, normal arcade setups, there were also fully dedicated arcades that we would go to. And of course, we would go to more of the standard strip mall kind of arcades over time. But one that I want to call out explicitly, and this is one that was a mega arcade, very similar to what you see with like a Dave & Buster's kind of thing. The one I want to talk about, though, was a place called Exhilarama. Exhilarama was located in the Echelon Mall, and this was an awesome mega arcade. It's kind of like, or it was kind of like a less bar themed Dave & Buster's. Like Dave & Buster's you go to and it has a big arcade. It has a ton of cool things. We may actually talk about Dave & Buster's in a little bit, but it has this mega arcade, but it also is kind of like a sports bar feel kind of thing. There's different restaurants and stuff. So Dave & Buster's is kind of an entertainment complex. Exhilarama was a mega arcade. They had so many different things there, tons of different arcade games, as well as games of chance. There was even an interesting fishing game where you would try to catch these mechanical fish from a pseudo lazy river kind of thing. My brother really liked that one. I enjoyed playing it too, but he was a little bit younger than I was, so he was more intrigued by that kind of fishing game. It was cool because it was an actual real thing, meaning the water was real water and the fish were really floating around in the water. Now, of course, it was basically like a magnet thing where you kind of get to try to line up the magnet with the fish, and then you pick up the fish and you win something. It was pretty cool, but Exhilarama was gigantic. The biggest thing, though, with Exhilarama, and the reason I remember it so fondly, was Exhilarama was the first place that I experienced what was then known as virtual reality. I believe I've relayed this story before, but the virtual reality of today, where you put on a headset or even sometimes just a pair of goggles and suddenly you're whisked away into this other world where sometimes it even tracks your movement as you're walking around the game world. Sometimes you don't even need to use controllers. It's actually able to track your hands and let you use your hands in those games. The concept of virtual reality today is absolutely amazing. The concept of virtual reality back in the early to mid 90s was very much more limited, but it was still awesome for the time because before trying virtual reality at Exhilarama, the only thing I knew was traditional video games. I knew about playing games at home on a console on a TV screen. I knew about playing games in an arcade using a joystick and buttons, and once again, seeing a monitor, seeing all of those visuals on a monitor. I didn't know what it was going to feel like to have a massive headset dropped onto my head and then being fully immersed in the environment that I was playing in. That was what that first virtual reality experience was. Now, I got to paint a picture though, because I don't want anybody to think that this was advanced in comparison to what we have today. In comparison to what we have today, virtual reality of the early to mid 90s was very limited. You literally had a gigantic headset that was almost like a tank, and it was attached to a massive metal crane system. And the way that it would work is you'd pay your money to play the virtual reality game, and then you would stand there, they'd put you in this enclosure, and then they would literally lower this metal contraption over your head, kind of like Darth Vader's helmet, but way bigger. They would lower it over your head, and then inside would be a couple of kind of, I guess, spots for your eyes to look in. And when you would do that, you'd be immersed in whatever environment that you were playing. Now, the games back then were very simple. They were all polygonal graphics. They were all flat shaded polygons. Think about like a game like Virtua Fighter, where it's all 3D, it's all polygonal characters and stuff like that. You can see the polygons on the screen and everything is flat shaded. So it's definitely a three-dimensional environment, but it is not anything like we had today. There was no texture mapping. There was nothing like that. And I remember the earliest virtual reality games that I played at Exhilarama, you were effectively kind of controlling a tank. You would maneuver around this battlefield and you'd try to shoot the opponents because there were a few different virtual reality setups hooked up and networked to each other. So it was actually a multiplayer kind of thing where you can drive around, you could shoot the other opponents, they would try to shoot you. And I just remember having so much fun and thinking, wow, I can't believe this thing exists in reality, because it was so different. It was so different than the traditional arcade kind of setup where everything you see is on a two-dimensional plane. This was true 3D, and not only was it true 3D, but you were physically in the game, or at least that's what it felt back then. Now, of course, comparing virtual reality from then to virtual reality now, it's a pale comparison. But back then, it felt like something truly special. And I remember going to Exhilarama. A lot of times we'd go to Exhilarama, and the first thing I would want to do is play that virtual reality game because it was so different than anything else I had experienced before. I'll always remember Exhilarama. I am 99.9% sure that that place closed down years ago. But it was just, and it's unfortunate that all of these places have closed down because I know that the business model doesn't really work nowadays, or you have to have most arcades today, they don't really make their money off of the games. They make their money more so off of the food and alcohol sales. And that's just the way the business is nowadays from an arcade perspective. But man, do I miss the days of dedicated arcades where all you had to do was spend your quarters in the machines or spend dollars or whatever. And it was really just focused on the gaming and not all of the other stuff. That is my ideal arcade memory, is the pure arcade where you'd go into there and you'd have some guy walking around with one of those change dispensing machines on his belt. Literally a bunch of quarters there. You hand him a $10 bill and it's like, he'd hit the little slots to get the thing, or sometimes you hand him enough money and he'd give you a roll of quarters. That was when you knew. You were going to have a good time. If you had a roll of quarters, you were going to have some fun at that arcade. But, oh man, I miss those times. I miss it. I truly do miss it. Anyway, moving past Exhilarama, there was another place that I would play arcade games a lot that was definitely not traditional. Maybe, I don't know. You guys have to tell me. When I used to go to my orthodontist's office, and I know this is going to sound weird, but when I was younger, I did have to have braces. So I would go to the orthodontist's office every month to have to get my braces put on and then to have them adjusted on a monthly basis. And then when I would go to the orthodontist's office, which by the way was not a fun experience, if anybody had braces when they were younger, I have no idea what braces are like today. Apparently they're way better with Invisalign and all that kind of stuff. But the orthodontists or the braces of the past with the all metal kind of stuff, and it was so painful, man. Vanity is pain sometimes. But so I went to the orthodontist office on a monthly basis when I had my braces, and the overall experience kind of sucked. But the one thing that made it cool was the fact that he had a couple of old school arcade games in his waiting area. So I would go to the orthodontist office, and the first thing I would do would be going right over to the machines. And he had a couple of different games. He had Asteroids and he had Space Invaders. And what I remember most about these machines, because obviously everybody knows Space Invaders and Asteroids. If you've played or looked at classic arcade games, you know those two, because those are true classics. But what I remember most is that I didn't have to put quarters in the machine. It was set up for free play, but not really. So basically, rather than do a quarter, there was this button, which was almost like a doorbell that was built into the machine. And all you had to do was press the button and you'd get a credit, which I thought was the coolest thing. Now, I've talked to other people who said that their dentist's office or orthodontist's office or whatever also had arcade machines in their lobbies. I don't know if that's a thing still today. My guess is no, that it's probably not. But I remember how cool it felt to go in there and be like, oh, yeah, I'm getting my braces adjusted, but I'm going to have a round of Asteroids before I go in there. You're going to wait, Mr. Orthodontist, because I'm in the middle of this game. And well, no, I didn't actually do that. Once I got called back, I had to drop whatever I was doing, which really did suck. But I just enjoyed it. And it was one of those things where you wouldn't expect, or at least I didn't expect at an orthodontist's office to have a couple of arcade machines, but they did. And it made that experience just a little bit less painful, a little bit less onerous than what it would have otherwise been. And I did enjoy it. Ultimately, that was kind of cool. And then, I've got a few more on my list, but I want to talk about a couple. I was going to talk about Dave & Buster's a little bit, and specifically the Dave & Buster's in Philadelphia, which opened up back in 1995, and my father, brother, and I would go to fairly frequently through the early 2000s. That was one of those mega arcade complexes like I was talking about before. I do want to call out a couple of games from there. I'm not going to spend much time talking about Dave & Buster's because it does still exist today, even though the feeling of going to D&B is very different today than what it was. But over at Dave & Buster's, because it was such a large arcade, they had a number of games that other arcades didn't necessarily have. They had a ton of FMV games. They had Mad Dog McCree. They had Crime Patrol. They had Fast Draw Showdown, which was probably my favorite of the FMV American Laser games, because not only were you combating bad guys, but in this one, you actually had a quick draw. So you had to holster your light gun before you would get into the competition. And then when the screen said draw, you'd have to pull your gun as fast as possible and try to shoot the opponent on the screen. And it would tell you how quickly you drew your gun. And there were high score leaderboards and all that kind of stuff. I really loved that game. Beyond that, though, Dave & Buster's was also a spot that we played a lot of racing games back then. Daytona USA was by far our personal favorite. We would, a lot of times, we'd go to Dave & Buster's, we'd go in the arcade, and we would make a beeline right for the linked up Daytona USA cabinets. And they had like 8 of them linked up. And you would be playing Daytona USA with your friends and other people that were just competing against you. And it was so cool trying to get first place when you were competing against all of these different people that were literally sitting there playing at the same time. Daytona USA is probably the best. I'm going to say it. It is almost certainly the best arcade racing game that has ever been released, at least in the arcades themselves. I know we had a whole episode on Daytona USA and we talked about the home ports and some of them were better than others and all that kind of stuff. But Daytona USA in the arcades, by far, one of the best, if not the best, arcade racing experience to ever have been created. And I don't care what modern games are out there today from a racing standpoint, Daytona USA definitely has its spot on my personal list. Beyond Dave & Buster's, there were also, and I mentioned this earlier, there were just local arcades that would sometimes pop up around you, around where you lived. There was an arcade that used to be near or in our Acme shopping center back when we lived in New Jersey. And it was just cool to visit because it was local. I mean, the one that was near Acme, that was literally 5 minutes away. So you better believe we spent a lot of time over there playing those games. The one game that I didn't talk about yet that I remember fondly playing at that location was WrestleFest. I've mentioned in various capacities before that I used to be a very big wrestling fan. I'm still a wrestling fan, but I don't really watch wrestling all that much. I still kind of follow some of it, but the wrestling of the 90s and early 2000s, that was my jam. I loved wrestling, and WrestleFest was an amazing game. It had such huge, detailed graphics, and it just felt like you were playing this advanced version of wrestling. Everything felt really meaty and heavy, and like everything that you did felt like it mattered within the game. Man, I loved WrestleFest. We also used to play a lot of air hockey at that local arcade. Air hockey is one of those games, just like skee-ball, that it's more of a mechanical thing, but so much fun. And then another arcade opened up near us in the mid-90s as well. This one was located at the Deptford Mall. So Deptford is a place in South Jersey, and they have a mall there. And there was an arcade that had popped up. I believe nowadays there's actually a Round 1 arcade in the Deptford Mall. I was doing a little bit of research, and it looks like there's a Round 1 in there. Round 1 is another one of those mega arcade complexes. But back in the mid-90s, there was a traditional kind of just arcade with a bunch of cabinets lining the walls and up and down the floors. And they had a ton of great games there. There was Time Crisis. There was Silent Scope. There was Virtua Cop, Tekken 2, Virtua Fighter 2, House of the Dead. All of these great games. And the fact is that arcades in general were just awesome. I loved going to arcades. I wish there was a way to replicate the feeling of going to an arcade today, but the fact is that arcades today just don't feel like the way they used to, and that is something that I definitely miss. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this nostalgia trip through some of my fondest arcade memories from the 80s and 90s, a truly magical time for me as well as countless others. While arcades do still exist today, like we've been talking about, I would argue that modern arcades, even those focused on retro experiences, can't truly capture the magic of the arcades from the past, which featured graphics, gameplay experiences, and control schemes that couldn't possibly be mimicked by home consoles or computers. Back then, arcades were a place to socialize and be amazed at the kinds of gaming experiences you simply couldn't get at home. With the proliferation of modern technology, both from a gaming and social perspective, arcades of today simply don't feel the same. While I do love the fact that there are still arcades to visit in 2026, The fact remains that the arcades of the 80s and 90s were truly magical, and the experiences I had during that time, much like some of the best games we've discussed previously, are truly Pantheon worthy.
Here come the heroes to save the world from destruction. They are X-Men.
That was our nostalgia trip talking about going to the arcades in the 80s and 90s. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Castle of the Winds, so definitely write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Castle of the Winds. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.